Welcome to the Sacred Stew. I'm your host, James. This is my co-host, Anthony. And we are getting together on this cold, wintry day during the Yuletide season, as they call it, to just talk about Yule and talk about things that we practice, a little bit of history on it, and hopefully by the end of this conversation, we will impart some good ideas for people to implement and do during the Yule season. So with that said, Anthony, I know that it's been a few weeks since we've actually dropped an episode. We've tried a couple times to connect. It just seemed it didn't work out. We got to try to find a little bit more time as much as we can, but during the holiday seasons, it becomes a little bit difficult to do these podcasts.
Especially when we both still got 9 to 5s.
Speaking of which, it's so cold, they're calling the storm that's sweeping across the nation a once-in-a-generation storm. I remember when I was a kid, actually, we had a ice storm that impacted all of the Midwest, knocked out electricity for, I think it was like a couple weeks, actually, where I lived at. And we had to warm ourselves with a kerosene heater in the house and have light by candles, which I guess kind of harkens back to the old days and such. Have you ever experienced a blackout like that from winter storms?
Yeah, last year. Last year down here, it wasn't a full-fledged storm, but enough things happened that it knocked out power to me in April for like a day or two.
Oh, yeah. You're talking about the April snowstorm that just happened all of a sudden, like the first or second day of April? Yeah, we got dumped 3 feet of snow pretty much where I live overnight. That was insane.
Yeah, and it was like, I want to say good 5-6 inches in the Portland area. And, that's like unheard of.
Which is a snowmageddon. Yeah, that's like a snowmageddon for real for urban nights.
Yeah, y'all over in the Midwest and in other parts of the country, 5-6 inches might be normal in the winter. Up here in the Pacific Northwest, it's usually more wet than snowy. That is snowmageddon in the big cities.
Well, at least for elevations below like 1,000 feet sea level, it's mostly rainy. Because where I live, we do actually, we're at 1,500 feet, and we do get snow where I live. So we have a wintry, snowy Yule time.
Well, you're in BFE, so.
So, hey, since our last episode, man, that really got a lot of conversations going, and I don't really want to jump back into it because so much time has passed now since that conversation. But I like the dialogue that we're creating and that we're engaging in. And the only thing I will say is, a lot of people kind of miss the point of what we were talking about, in regards to foreign Platonic thought and such, thinking that we are trying to argue the merits of the Platonic system, which we were not. We were pointing out that it's not a germanic theological or religious spiritual system.
Yeah, and while some people would argue that there are certain aspects that would fit or could mesh, we're not trying to pick and choose. We are just saying that as a greater whole, the Platonic theory, being a foreign influence, is not compatible with our ancestral ways.
Exactly. But let's not spend too much time on that at all, because I do want to make this broadcast, this podcast here, mostly just about the Yule time traditions and how it's practiced and what is tradition, what isn't tradition, a little bit of history of it. But one more thing I want to get to before we jump to that is those polls that we put out on our Telegram channel. Speaking of which, If you guys don't follow us on Telegram, you should. We have a channel there where we post different topics, different ideas, different discussions, different things that people might find of interest. Especially during this Yuletide season, we've been posting up essentially a kind of a traditional day-by-day guide for people that they could check out, and if they like it, implement it. But you can follow us on Telegram, YouTube, Anchor.fm. It's also on all of the major podcast medias like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. But check us out, follow us. If you like our content, share it. We are growing. But anyways, back to the polls that we did. All right, so we had 2 poll questions that we put out, and the first poll, actually, we had over 500 people cast a vote on this poll, and the results were pretty interesting. Essentially, it asks, what option below best describes the reason you are pagan? The first answer was the awe of nature, identity, tradition, theological beliefs, philosophical ideas, my children, I like to hang out and drink, it seems pretty cool, there's a lot of badass tattoos, or other. So these were the list of choice that people could select on the reason why they became pagan or are pagan. Do you remember which one had the highest vote, Anthony?
I want to say, off the top of my head, it was a toss-up between tradition, children, and other. I want to say those 3 were fairly close, but I can't remember which was the number one.
So the number one reason why people identified or are pagan was 29% voted for identity, 23% voted for the awe of nature, and 15% voted on tradition. Those were the top 3. And I actually really found this a good poll, because what I'm trying to do with these polls is I'm trying to kind of classify different aspects, because I had some people comment to me that, you know, some of these things interlap, like, for example, tradition and identity, or theological beliefs and tradition, or the awe of nature and theological beliefs. They kind of overlap a little bit. But what I'm trying to do is get somebody's natural gut reaction out of these polls to identify, you know, the concept that makes them a pagan in their mind. We did have the option for there's a lot of badass tattoos, and apparently there's a couple people out there that applies to, Anthony.
I was going to say, if those people got honor tattoos, we might have to have a discussion with them.
Honor tattoos.
Yeah.
Here's the phrase: honor tattoos, the tramp stamp of Vikings in the modern age. But then also, one of the other options was I like to hang out and drink. There was a few people that also voted that way. And I actually appreciate the honesty of people in their decisions here, you know, because there's a lot of people that do actually participate in events and stuff, but they don't necessarily, like, understand the traditions or believe in the traditions. But they feel some sort of camaraderie there that just the energy apparently they like to be around. We were at a bloat last weekend, actually, and there was somebody there that said he doesn't really know too much about, you know, the faith or the traditions, and he's not really interested in religion. But then as we started going through the whole bloat and the event, you know, I guess afterwards he started asking a lot of questions like, hey, well, what is this? You know, so it is an important thing, even if people are just hanging around the fire drinking, you know, that brotherhood, sisterhood, the camaraderie that we build, because that's actually the true religion. It's actually the true faith, that spirit that we have between each other.
Yeah, like that answer I kind of put on level with that. There's some people that have been drawn to our faith, say from the Marvel movies, the Marvel Thor movies, or the Thor comic books. Whatever piques your interest and brings you in the door. Like, I'm not gonna knock whatever it is that gets you to come home. Because you come around, you're gonna enjoy the vibes, you're gonna start feeling it, and you're gonna learn more. I don't care what brings you home, just come home.
Yeah, and there's not a better time to actually talk about coming home than especially in the Yuletide season, because that's what it is about, is that family bond, those connections that we have with our, not just our blood family, but our inner circle of friends that we share life with. And if a lot of people out there don't have that, and we need to be inviting into our circles of people that have a genuine interest to actually build that. So, but on those poll results, identity is the number one reason why people identify themselves as pagan. So the second poll question that we asked, this question really kind of followed. I have this line of thinking where I'm trying to systematically break down the gut instincts of people and narrow a couple, I guess, ideological or theological concepts down that really hone in for people. So this one kind of follows the previous question. The question is, what option below best describes and or defines your identity? So obviously taking the response of people as identity being the reason that they're pagan in the previous question. This question, I'm trying to understand, what is it that best describes or that identifies that identity? First answer is spirituality and theology, traditions and customs, nationality, race, culture, Germanic, Celtic, Indo-European, Aryan, or other. Which one did you choose, Anthony?
I want to say I chose customs and traditions. Just because, for me, the nationality or race, it's a thing that is not my first focus. And I do acknowledge that there were slight differences between various regions of our folk. So I think for me, it was just learning the broader customs and traditions. And me personally, I'm not a big fan of the broader Indo-European minded movement, because I feel like we go that far back and we're just blending and watering down the traditions of our ancestors. We're just trying to force them all back together to a singular point, and that is antithetical to the spirit of our ancestors. We are always moving forward. Different groups are going to define themselves, and to just go back to the Indo-European point negates the Norse, our Nordic ancestors, negates our Germanic ancestors, negates our Anglo-Saxon ancestors, so on and so forth.
Right. Well, I also chose traditions and customs. And again, this was one of the poll questions, where I got responses from people saying, hey, I would choose multiple of these. They're all kind of interconnected. And that's the case. But I'll give an example. I chose traditions and customs versus choosing, for example, Germanic, because while I do identify as Germanic and have a love for the Germanic tribe, the traditions and customs of the Germanic tribe, obviously, that is what makes it, Germanic, or that is the culture. However, if I choose Germanic over traditions and customs, at least in my mind, the way I see it, is I'm identifying more on a superficial level of things that doesn't necessarily give me a connectedness to what it is for being Germanic. So the results of this poll, the top three were: number one was Germanic. So that was the number one identifier, and we had over 140 people vote in this poll. So I appreciate everybody that's participating in this. It's helping our discussions and the things that we talk about in the podcast, and just conversations with our friends and families and chats, and in real life interactions as well. The second choice was spirituality and theology, which can again be part of the corpus of traditions and customs. You know, some of these things are really closely tied together. Traditions and customs was fourth. So the answer that got the third amount of votes was Aryan, that they feel like that word is what defines or describes their identity best. So, and I certainly understand people's intent with choosing that. We did a episode in season 1 where we actually kind of discuss the terminology of Aryan, how it came to be. I would recommend that people go listen to that, because while I'm not totally against the use of it, I think that is a word that doesn't necessarily best encompass who we are as a tribal folk of the Germanic peoples. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree. It's not the best descriptive term, and as much as I hate modernity and all the stuff that's going on, we do also have to be mindful of what terms we're using individually and collectively to present ourselves in the best possible light. We're never going to look, quote unquote, good to certain groups of people, but we still have to present ourselves in the best possible light that we can. And to use what I understand to be a grammatically incorrect term that also has such a negative visceral response from the majority of even our own folk is counterproductive.
Yes, generations of brainwashing has certainly seen to certain trends in the thinking processes we have today as a society, especially in the Western nations. It's amazing that they've been able to actually teach our own people, our own folk, our own children to hate ourselves. I have a niece, Jessica's niece actually, that now calls her mother the birthing person instead of mother. It's really sad what they're doing to our children. It's one of the reasons why how we identify ourselves is so important.
Yeah.
Towards the discussion about Yule, it is so important for us in this time to gather with our families, to share stories, to share knowledge, to share information with one another, so that we can actually raise healthy children that have good relationships with their kith and kin, that understand their place in the universe and are not easily manipulated and controlled. But I don't want to turn the podcast into a political discussion, especially during this season when we're recording it, Yuletide. So, it's beginning to look a lot like Yuletide. How do you feel about the season, Anthony? How's your Yuletide going?
I mean, I recognize the importance of it. One of the big things that I am adjusting to coming into our ancestral traditions is I was raised Jehovah's Witness. So holidays in general didn't have any sort of real significance. So for me, a lot of times, like, I'm having to kind of force myself into the Christmas spirit or the Yuletide spirit, just because it's a learning curve it's been the hardest learning curve for me, really.
I think a lot of people actually, even people that identify as heathen or Germanic pagans or whatever term they want to call themselves, actually suffer from the exact same thing. Not necessarily getting in the spirit of the time, with having family and friends over, but in the sense of being able to actually connect with an authentic Yuletide tradition, one that actually has substance and means something. Just because a lot of heathens today have only recently, as adults, come into heathenry. So for them, a lot of them are just kind of bouncing around of like, how do I do this? How do I figure out, what's what in this tradition? So I can understand certainly what you're saying, but yours is even to an even more severe degree because you weren't even raised with any type of quote unquote Christmas spirit during these times.
Yeah. And I know like another aspect, and I know I'm not the only one that has this. We depending on who you ask, you're going to hear 3 nights of Yule, 9 nights of Yule, 12 nights of Yule, 13. I've heard 13 nights of Yule, and everybody's going to have an articulated point. So, especially if you're new, you're always going to have that nagging question in the back of your mind. Whatever number you choose to do, you're going to be like, oh, am I doing this right? And that's going to really affect your ability to get into the practice and the spirit of it.
No, you're right 100%. There's a lot of confusion that just has embedded itself in the Yule tradition and what it is and how we recognize it. I mean, if you go through folklore itself, there are tons and tons of stories, for example, about the wild hunt, and there's lots of various descriptions of it. And I think, what a lot of people do is they absorb that information that they hear from these stories that were recorded, and they don't really get past what the symbolism of it is, and they see a lot of contradictions in, well, it says this and it says this over here. What exactly is it? Is King Arthur the bear king that comes back after Yule? Is he the one that goes on the wild hunt? Is it Odin? Is it Halle? What exactly is happening? And how do I make sense of it? But, and I want to touch on all of those things, but I want to first actually touch on the spirit of this time and what was transpiring during this period of time for our folk and ancestors in the past. Because before modern era, with electricity and heat that can be used throughout the heat the whole home, we lived in darkness with candles and fires that kept us warm and gave us light. And during this period of time, it was known to be, the start of the cold, the shortest of the days in the year. And so families would gather in their homes and they would get together. During the summer, the spring and summer and fall, they were out hunting, traveling on many different journeys, getting new things to bring back to the stead for the wintertime. And when they would do this, they would have feasts and give gifts to each other and tell stories to one another. So I think those basic concepts of what actually physically happens during that winter period for us in connection to our family is that's the spirit of what this is all about, of what this holiday is all about. And you being raised a Jehovah Witness is kind of sad, at least, the way I see it, that you probably didn't have, any sort of like family get-togethers during this time, did you?
I mean, my mom would get me and my sister presents, but like it was never on any specific day. And it very early on, I pretty much figured out that my mom just got me and my sister's presents so we wouldn't get picked on for not getting presents during Christmas time. I mean, which is a very loving thing to do. Like, I'm not knocking her for that at all. But when you're 6, 7, 8 years old, and that's the only reason you're getting something, you're happy for the gifts, but there's an understanding. Like, especially in my case, like I was the only son. It was me, my mom, and my sister. So I'm watching out for my sister. Like very early, I was forced into looking at things like that and having to understand it.
Whereas I was raised, with a whole tradition, albeit one based with the Christian motive overhead of it. But, even with those Christian motives, and whether or not you actually had a tradition during this time, there's one thing I think everybody acknowledges is that everything about what is called the Christmas season or the Yuletide season is 100% heathen. Like, it goes back to the most ancient roots that predate Christianity.
I believe we touched on some of this stuff in our 2-part Christian conversion episodes.
Yeah, a little bit. And, the part of this that, and by the way, another plug, go check out those episodes if you haven't. Very important. Even leads to the discussion today about, how Yule was subverted. But before we get to that part of the conversation, I just thought I might share some of the things that we do in my house during this period. That way, for people out there that are wondering, what they can do, ideas for different things during this period. And I recognize that there are two aspects to Yule. This period not actually being the Yule itself, but rather part of the Yule tide or the season of Yule. Yule itself actually comes in January. But during this season, what my family does is we have a nightly ritual that we do during the 3 days of the solstice. And we get together as a family in a circle. We have some prayers and say some stories, and then we give an offering, and we light our Yule flame, and we carry it around our home. And the woman of the house, Jessica, my wife, actually carries it around, and she says a prayer to the Disir, to the goddesses, seeking, warmth and fertility and light and love and laughter and happiness to be in this home as a ward to our home, because the cold was a force that drove you into your homes, and you were seeking shelter from that cold and all of the ills that come with it. So for me and my practice and what I do is, during those 12 days, every night we have some sort of offering that we give to either the Mother of Night herself, the goddess Nat, or to Frigga, the earth, and then also to the Disir when we give to her. And then we give offerings throughout this period to the land Vatir around our home, the land spirits, whites, and then obviously Odin. So I correspond, and we can get to a little bit more of this later, but I correspond the 12 days of Yule as we know it to the 3 days of the solstice, and then the 9 days of the wild hunt. I also do gift giving with my children, but instead of it being on a specific day, we open a gift each day of those days. So it's a really fun time for the family and kids. One other little tradition we have, and there's no authenticity to this, but I did read some time ago or heard a story some time ago about some tradition in Iceland where they would hop around the home 3 times. And it might have been part of some type of land taking rite or something, but I had read this many, many years ago, or heard it many, many years ago. And when my children were super small and just learning how to, walk and run, this tradition began in my house, where on each of the nights, the 12 nights, after we give our offering and the prayer is said with the housewife leading that vigil, we do what is called the magic stocking. And the magic stocking is we have a little dance that we do where we hop around on one leg in a circle 3 times, and we have a little song that we made up and do a little jingle to that. And then when my children are younger, they kind of caught on since, but when they were younger, the stockings would just magically fall, and they would find them and be able to choose something out of that stocking. Of course, it was me hiding the stockings and secretly letting them drop from my arms. But the kids really loved that idea. But that's some things that we do in my home, and maybe you guys can implement something similar if you don't know or have any ideas or traditions of what you can do. I don't know. What do you think about those traditions that I have, Anthony?
I mean, whether they're quote unquote authentic or not historically, like, that sounds super fun for little kids. And that's a huge portion of this is bringing the family together, building those relationships, and just having fun. Like, I mean, I feel like in this regard, I would personally go with, even if you just make up some random stuff to do each night, like, it's in the spirit of it. Like, there is a lot of room for individualization when it comes to what's happening in the home. So, I mean, I was smiling while you were describing it, just thinking about how I would have felt as a kid, being little, and I'm hopping around the floor having a good time, and all of a sudden stockings full of presents are magically appearing.
And in another light, regarding these traditions that I do, it's also a good means to introduce or explain certain aspects of the Yule tradition to them. And I want to relate this a little bit back to you, where you talked about not really having a tradition when you grew up. Like, there was no quote unquote significant element to what was happening during this season in creating that, because even as pagans today, many of them are confused. There's all this conflicting information out there. How do you practice it? Are you doing it right? Are you not doing it right? But the thing is, creating that tradition, even if it's your own, although, I will present an argument of a very good tradition that I practice that I, think that would benefit others here later in the podcast. But creating that tradition, or having that tradition that you do, even if you don't actually believe in it, is important for the next generation that we're raising now. Because after hundreds of years of us being programmed to not believe in our native faith, it's important that as we're awakening to what that native faith is, and the attachment to our old traditions and customs and the beliefs in our gods, that we pass this down to our children in a way that will be cohesive for them and can be understood easily by them. And that's what these traditions are doing. So there's the old phrase, fake it till you make it. And so many of us are damaged today just because of our upbringings in this society that has turned to just a cesspool of indecency, that even if we are faking, going through the motions, the children that we're teaching that are coming after us will inherit something that actually means something to them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I've heard the saying "fake it till you make it" before. I'm a little bit more of a fan in certain regards of "fake it till you become it," but tomato, tomato.
So, what do you understand about the Yule tradition from a mythological or folkloric standpoint, Anthony?
So I've got a fairly basic understanding. I know that some of it revolved around the shortest day of the year. Oftentimes in certain parts of especially Northern Europe during this time of the year, the sun would be gone for days at a time. So the tradition and rituals were about bringing the sun back. I've read some things where the wild hunt is chasing away the Jotun and the negative, malevolent spirits that keep the sun away and cause other problems. And there is some suggestion that it is also representative of the reign of the false Odin or a false Odin, and that the rituals are to bring Odin back. Lot of different stuff. Things that do kind of seem to conflict with one another.
Right. And the problem is that we have a lot of this recorded in folklore versus the mythological stories of it. So, and we spoke about the folklore in the previous episode, where folklore was more regionalized and the stories had a lot more variance because of it being regionalized. That and a lot of it was manipulated by the church itself because of how dispersed these stories were on a regional level. But you have, like, for example, the story of the wild hunts, and there's a lot of confusion of what exactly this is. And I would argue that those folkloric stories are just remnant memories of a deeper understanding that the folk had of what they represented, what these periods of time and what these stories represented. That there's a much older understanding that pervades beneath just the general level of telling the story of Odin going on the wild hunts and collecting souls, or Perchta, grabbing souls and babies and such. A lot of stories are even invented in the last couple hundred years, excuse me. Like the story of Jack Frost and the story of Santa Claus has evolved over time. We can see a lot of these stories, and though they have their roots in our heathen past, they're just like over layers of the culture at the time that was still seeking some sort of mythic representations that they knew from before the conversion period.
What about Krampus? Feel like we
What
need to
about
bring
Krampus?
feel like we need to bring him back. You mess up, this big white monster is going to throw you in his sack.
And there's a lot of little tales like that. Not just Krampus. even like I believe the original stories of the figure that we understand as Santa Claus, as being like a wood maker, a toy maker that would travel the forests, and if he encountered children that were bad or not hospitable towards him, that he would also take those children. And I think a lot of this mythic lore is just coated with a layering of just some sort of cultural thing of the time that the story emerges. But underneath that layer resides a general truth or an understanding that we once held as a folk and a people before we were converted or absorbed into this Christian faith. So speaking of being absorbed into the Christian faith, because this is a part of that conversation, is the whole Yuletide period and how it became essentially a Christian holiday. The Constantine was the person in the 4th century that made December 25th a day of Christ's birth. Every religious scholar in the world, pretty much, even the Christian ones, will tell you that December 25th is not actually the birth of Christ, and that it has its roots in paganism. But they did this essentially to try to subvert what we were worshiping in the tradition and practice that we had, and associate that with a false religion that they brought to us. And there was a lot of confusion caused by this. Hakon did the same thing, I believe, in the 1200s, somewhere around there. There's about when he moved the practice of the Yule to coincide with essentially the Roman Catholic Church at the time. He was falling in line with them. But we know because of a few authors, ecclesiastical authors specifically, Bede, where he does talk about when Yule was practiced and that there was feasts and that it lasted for 3 days. So there is historicity to it, but there's a lot of mud that's been thrown in the water as far as what these days are, when we observe them, and how to observe them. And it gets a little bit into the theological concept of why we perform bloat. And there's a cosmological process that's happening at this time of the year that we need to re-understand. If you had to take a shot in the dark, Anthony, what would you say is the cosmological or theological process that's happening at this time for our people?
The cosmological process, I would, shot in the dark, pun intended, would expounding upon needing or trying to bring the sun back. I would argue that there is some piece of the story of the false Odin being true on a cosmological, theological level, or I would put more focus on Odin leading the wild hunt to snatch up the dead, so the Draugr are not bothering people, but to chase away the other malicious spirits that would seek to harm the folk. That's my shot in the dark.
All right. Well, and we've discussed a little bit before in the past about bloat and the significance of it, and specifically the public process of bloat, not the private ones that people have in their homes, but the public ones that we are commanded by Odin himself in the Ynglinga saga to observe. And these bloats tie into the theological and cosmological processes that are at play during this time of the year. Now, let's revisit the purpose of bloat, because this has been an age-old question that heathens have had for at least the last 50 or 60 years when we've been rediscovering what our faith is why do we actually perform bloat? What is the purpose of it? Is it just to, do an exchange offer, of here, I'm giving you a gift, now give me something? Or is there some sort of deeper significance to it? In the episode that we did on deicide and the sacred bloat, if you haven't listened to it, go back and listen to it, because we kind of explained the premise. But to give a summary again of this, there are 9 specific needs of man. And these 9 needs, we seek the aid of the gods for their yarga, or their help against these needs. And these needs have everything to do with us in our survival, as not just individuals, but as a collective, as a tribe, as a folk, as one people. And these needs specifically are famine, misfortune, transgression, peril, war, conflict, concealment or hidden things, poverty and hunger, infertility, and sickness and plagues. These are the 9 needs that were unleashed upon us, and they come from the Jotun. Laken is their overseer. She is the one that brings pestilence in the theological construct of our Germanic belief system. And we can see things captured, regarding how this works when, for example, we speak about elves. For example, there's the saying that, I did not know if it was an elf that shot the arrow of sickness. Essentially, that our ancestors understood that these sicknesses, these plagues, these ills that happen, that there's a force behind them that caused them to harm us. And so when we perform bloat, we are essentially reconnecting, reaffirming our connection to the gods and our loyalty to them for their protection with our luck over these 9 needs during our lifespan. Now, each of these 9 sacred bloats that we perform throughout the course of a year come in the form of 3 vislas, or festivals, that happen. We have the autumn festival, which we spoke about in previous episodes as well, where we do bloat to Freyr, the Disir, and the Elven. And then we have also mentioned the Yule bloat period. The Yule bloat, we perform bloat to Thor, which is Thor bloat, followed by Yule bloat, which is to Odin, for he is Yulnir. And then we also perform a sonar bloat to Freyr. And then we have the 3rd festival, which is called Sommermal, which is the summer bloats. And these bloats are the Sigurd bloat, the victory bloat. Then we have the Goa bloat, and then the Gefjonar bloat. So these are the 9 bloats that are performed at the course of the year. And each one of those bloats correspond to one of these 9 needs. And they're performed specifically as a rite of protection from the gods against these needs in our life. And what I argue for when it comes to this Yuletide season is that This season is the culmination of all 9 of those bloats that we perform throughout the different seasons of the year. And this is when the Aesir, Odin specifically, the companions of the wild hunt, come during this period of time to essentially get rid of the ills that would cause us harm or cause us to suffer from these 9 needs. This is the Bjarga that Odin is fulfilling through that entire process. I do also believe that there's another aspect that is happening at this time as well. I believe at this time that we also see a transmigration of souls that are happening during this period of time. Something of significance for me, in relation, because a lot of people will argue the 12 days of Yule is specifically Christian because they culminate afterwards with the Feast of the Epiphany, or whatever they call that specific Christian tradition. But I would argue that that is an overlay of what the original or authentic Yule 12-day period was. That period first begins with 3 days of the solstice. And we know from the Anglo-Saxon sources that during the solstice period, they had a tradition that was called Mother's Night, Mudrit Night. You know anything about the Mother's Night tradition or story, Anthony?
Just what you've shared with me, that while, yes, there is a bit of general mothers to it, its actual significance comes from acknowledging not the mother of night, who is also the mother of Frigga and Dagger. And yeah, that's about the extent of Mother's Night that I know.
Okay. Because a lot of people believe Mother's Night, and they've been practicing this tradition for years, which is, it's a wholesome tradition that they practice. But what I would point out to is that Mother's Night specifically relates to the winter solstice through the goddess that we know as Nat, or the goddess of night. And that the Mother's Night tradition is something that is attested to having been practiced, is essentially a night of recognition to Nat herself and giving offerings to her. I practiced this on the eve of the solstice itself. We have a ritual, as I kind of explained a little bit earlier, but we have a specific prayer that we say in my home on this night, and the offerings that we give. And then the second night, the night of the solstice, we then focus on Frigga, or Mother Earth, who is born from Nat. And that is because we seek to give her gifts to make her show us bounty during the wild hunt, because she is also a companion of Odin during this process. She's also the mother of Freya and Freyr, who give us bounties in different ways as well. And we essentially make a invocation to her that she whispers into the ears of Odin during the wild hunt that he may show favor upon us, and that she may also hearken to her children, Freya and Freyr, that they'll bring bounty into our life in the coming year. So that kind of comprises a couple of those solstice nights, and then begins the wild hunt, which last night, being the 22nd of December, I believe is when the wild hunt happens, and it's a 9-day period when Odin and his companions on the wild hunt essentially purge the land of ills that would seek to harm the folk. And I believe this is also where the Christmas tree tradition comes from. Everybody pretty much in America every year puts up a Christmas tree in their home. And we know that this tradition goes back hundreds of years of people doing it, but nobody actually really knows the origin of this tradition. However, I believe that the origin of this tradition, it goes all the way back to the time of the conversion periods, when our sacred groves were being destroyed. For it was during this period of Yule, during the wild hunt, when Odin would fly by, that our folk would gather for the ward tree in their grove, or the protection tree in their grove, and they would hang offerings to Hanging Tyr himself, to the hanging god himself, to Odin himself, to seek favors from him. And even as late as the 1600s, the Lappish folk would still actually hang food in what they would craft, these little boats with oars and udders and everything, and hang them from trees as a gift for the wild hunt. So this is a tradition like that we know actually existed. And I believe that during the conversion period, whenever our sacred groves were destroyed, and whenever the Christians were known to cut down our sacred trees, for example, like Thor's tree, our folk would begin to bring in a tree into their home, to conceal it, to still offer offerings to Odin during this period. And slowly over time, the absorption of this tradition became what we know as our modern day Christmas tree. At least that's what makes sense to me.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, I'm looking at my tree and I don't know, I got a little Batman figurine, a Nintendo controller. I don't know if Odin has much use for the decorations. I might be burnt. Right.
Well, I think by the time that we started putting decorations on the tree, I mean, our folk had generally, as a whole, lost that memory of what the purpose was. There was a time when we, not even that long ago, when people actually put candles burning on their Christmas trees. It was a thing. And that still goes back to the light in the flame, the sacred holy flame, which goes back to solstice itself again, that brings warmth and to our homes. But I think we can get back to doing it in the way that has significance if we look at the purpose behind why we do this. And I'm not saying that somebody has to sit in their home and say, I'm putting this on my tree because it represents this, but having an understanding of the actions that you're doing and partaking in does bring a deeper sense of significance to a person, and will also relay that significance to their children when they're doing it, and explaining these things to them to help them understand, telling them stories.
Bringing back a sense of why we do the things that we do is a very big thing, not just in Yule specifically, but across the board.
Do you know other Christmas traditions that may or may not be pagan?
I want to say the mistletoe wreath. I remember reading that somewhere, but I can't. I don't. I want to say that's something that had some significance to Balder. Outside of that, it was a mistletoe branch that killed him. But something about hanging the mistletoe and then kissing under the mistletoe. I want to say that had a pagan significance.
Yeah, I've heard that said as well, and it's funny that you bring that specific one up. I was at the bloat I was at last week. Somebody specifically asked me about that, and the odd part of it being the mistletoe is what actually killed Balder. Why would we see this as something of luck during this season or used? And I kind of have my own personal opinions on it. Nothing that I can specifically point to, but I think that it was actually something that was promoted as a tradition by the church itself, as a way to be somewhat subversive towards us. It's kind of like a slap in the face or a middle finger to Balder. I don't know, if there's any sort of validity to that belief that I have, but that's kind of my thoughts on it.
I mean, it would make sense to me, and I don't feel like that would break with their established MO.
Right. But people argue that the mistletoe, obviously, that, there's the story of like the Holly King and the Oak King, and they battle for control twice a year. And that, that's how it kind of relates, is the Holly King gaining the upper hand in the crown to wear during this period of time. And just like I mentioned earlier with other folklore tales, although this is a tale, I don't think folklore is necessarily true. I think that it hides truth within it, and it's layered in a way that you have to extract what that truth out of it is. And we also have to be cognizant of the fact that folklore was one of the main channels that the church used for propaganda, and we talked about this before, where they would replace, descriptions of our holy places as places where devils gather, for example. So I'm a lot more skeptical when it comes to the folkloric information, because it requires a very discerning eye to read behind the lines. But that also gets us to the question of, how do we discern that truth? And it's important that we have a true north that we look to, a litmus test that we use. And we've spoken in the past about the epic method, or the mythological method, for understanding theological beliefs and ritual practices. And the way that we do that is by actually taking Eddic and Skaldic poetry, which we know is the literal words of our heathen ancestors that spoke these things, and compare any other information to that, and something which contradicts that information, we have to set to the side, and be really skeptical, and really seek to try to understand how this could even fit in the pattern if it contradicts it. Sometimes it can, point in different directions, but we have to keep an open eye to that.
I was just going to say, like, for me, things like that, like the joy is in the journey. If I'm looking at something and it's going 5-6 ways, it's, how I am. I like to go down the 5-6 ways and just see what comes of it.
So you want to know another part of a Yule tradition, or part of the Yule process that a lot of people are unaware about, is the bear. Did you know that the bear has a very significant part of this season, this process?
Oh, well, I just want to say, we're going there. But I was waiting for this. No, outside of what's the word I'm looking for? The rites of passage, when it comes to men and kings or leaders doing a bear hunt, I do not know the significance of the bear to Yule. So please enlighten me in the audience.
So I'm not going to go fully into the bear stuff in this episode, because that that topic actually, deserves its own whole episode. And I know that people have gotten their tongues wet on the whole bear, quote unquote, cult thing. I wrote an article on the pnwkindreds.com website on the bear motif, and it's really educational. You can go find it if you like. I love that article actually. But in regards to the Yuletide period, so we know our folk had a very huge reverence for the bear, and we saw the bear as actually our ancestor, that women were called Bera, or female bears, and men were called Bjorn, or bear-born, or sometimes Thor-born, which the word born is the same word as bear, for example. But it was believed, and I also believe this, there's a metaphysical process to this though, and we'll get into that in the bear episode, but suffice to say for now that it was believed that the bear held powers over transforming during its hibernation period and able to leave its body, and that it assisted with the transmigration of the souls that exist. Now, in relation to this period of time, the Yuletide period, it's really hard to say exactly how the bear plays its role in this process with Odin, but it kind of hints at what I suggested earlier about that during this period there's also a migration of souls that happen. And in the corpus of the bear tradition and relating to the solstice and whatnot, there's this idea that somehow the bear, like in some of the oldest stories that we know of, hunts a stag, which is responsible for the death of the sun or the light, and essentially brings this back. Now, the bear itself, people debate this, but I believe this to be true, is the animal that Freya rides. I know a lot of people believe that it means cats, that her animals were, the feline creatures. But the word that's actually used for that is a word that can be just as easily translated to mean bear. So this idea that cats or the feline creatures is the animal of Freya may not actually be true, and it may just be a bad translation that has persisted for a couple hundred years now in people's understanding of this. The reason why this is important for me to bring up is because it is during the solstice process in the awakening of the sun that the regenerating powers of the fertility gods and goddesses like Freya and Freyr, for example, come to be. And that it is during this time, what I believe is that Freya is brought to the earth, guided by the bear, riding the bear, to bring her fertility in the spring. This is just an idea that I have. There's not a lot of information out there, but when I meditate on the importance of the bear and what it represented to our people, and the correlation with Freya riding this, and the bear's significance, and the winter hunt that would happen, where hunters would go find the caves of the bears during this period of time because they would be sleeping. This, to me, makes that connection of the bear. Is it, cohesive and gives, a full understanding of the role of the bear during this period? No, it doesn't. But it, at least for me, gives me an idea of what that role could be during this process. There's a lot of traditions that still exist in Europe. We have, like, for example, the bear festivals, and there's lots of places in Europe that have bear festivals. But there's also a tradition in several places of the wild men that essentially dress up during this Yule period, and they make themselves in the figure of like bear men. And I think this tradition comes about because of the significance of the bear during this period of time. Do you know anything about any of these festivals that I mentioned?
Sorry, my brain just went down a freaking weird rabbit hole. Okay, some people are going to call me crazy or too far off the woo-woo, but I've always wondered if there is any type of possibility that berserkers and Ulfendars, the most powerful of them, were actually able to change their physical shape. And that is where we get the like in the Ulfendar bit specifically, the werewolf.
Oh, absolutely. That's where the folklore of the werewolf, begins at, is that belief in the transformation of the man into the wolf. Was it a literal physical transformation like we see in werewolf movies today? I don't really buy that, but I think that there's a transformation within that person that happens during that process that makes him like the wolf inside. But there's no doubt that that is the origin stories of the werewolves, which is actually really cool that came up, because it's a good example of the truths behind folklore that we can find, that while the story itself is not necessarily true when they are saying, he went out and changed into a wolf, but rather, the metaphysical analogy of it is where the truth lies when it comes to folklore.
I was going to say, call me woo, but I still have an inkling of hope that there is some way of a physical transformation. Just a twinkling hope. I'll stop with my woo-woo stuff. Sorry.
No, that's really cool. But I should make sure I draw a distinction, because I know that there's some people that are just tuning into our podcast. There is a difference between folklore and the mythological lore. The mythological lore was not regionalized. It was broadly understood and spread broadly throughout all of the Germanic lands. Our folk had a single cosmological concept of how the universe works, the gods and goddesses. So when I speak about, the metaphysical truths of folklore being hidden, and the same thing can be said of mythological lore in a sense, but there's a certain part of the mythological lore that is true on the literal sense as well. There's so many layers to it. But I did want to make sure I made that distinction in this conversation so as not to confuse people.
Well, and I think folklore is also more representative of local culture. Like, there's a broader Germanic culture, but then there's the culture of the regions and the tribes in that region. To use an example, we are in the Pacific Northwest. You go down south, and we've got our own stuff, various stuff up here in the Pacific Northwest. The folks down south got their own stuff going on, and I'm just using that as it's two regions. For as much as we have in common, there are things that make us distinctly different. And in certain aspects, you could say we have our own separate folklores on things, but there are significant things that tie us together. Broader, cosmological, political. There are, on the big scale, there are things that make us the same. But when you break down the regions, there are also things that differentiate us. And I think folklore is an example of taking the bigger cosmological truths, and then there are regional focuses that, not that they invalidate, not that one invalidates the other or doesn't hold something as true or of lesser importance, but there's just more of a focus on certain things.
Right. There's like a regional expression of a bigger cosmological understanding.
Like you could also use the example of, there were some tribes that honored Thor, Frigga, Freyr as the patron or matron of their tribe, but even they still acknowledged Odin as Allfather.
Exactly. So I want to go through a couple of things here about the Yule period to give somebody a cohesive tradition. And I know that there's going to be people out there that are going to say, well, that's a modern interpretation, or where do you get your attestation of these practices? And I already mentioned, or we already mentioned at the beginning of this podcast about, just the importance of having that tradition that carries on. And what I do here, as I mentioned, is each night there's a specific prayer that we say over this 12-day period. And each night, there's 3 nights of the solstice. And we have to make sure that we understand that the day begins when the sun sets for our folk. That has always been true. It is not when the sun rises or when we awake on the day. So when I speak of days, I'm speaking of our historical days as we understood it in a lunar moon cycle, for we reckon time by the moon. So the first 3 days of the solstice, I've already kind of went over. And then the wild hunt, each night relates to a specific need. And these needs, I'll mention the Noriana Society and their great work that they did in bringing this to light for everybody in the purpose of bloat. But during the wild hunt period, each night, Odin is extinguishing specific forces or things which would seek to cause us ill. And I know some people will say that the idea of like evil never really existed for the concept of the Germanic people, but that's simply not true. The word evil, in fact, comes from the word ill, which is a very Germanic word. We understood bad things to happen to us as things which were evil. So, or things which caused us ill or harm. So, that's the understanding of it. During these 9 nights of the wild hunt, we hang upon the ward tree our offering to Odin to show us favor. Last night, I'll give everybody here an example of one of the prayers that we said at my home. And we shared this on the channel too, so if you haven't checked out the Sacred Stew channel on Telegram, you can download Telegram on your Android or Apple store, or you can go to their website and download it directly from there. But let me see here. As Odin rides on this first night of the wild hunt, we remember the 9 needs that cause us ill: famine, misfortune, transgression, peril, war, concealment, poverty, infertility, sickness, Odin shall ride for 9 nights, each night collecting beings that seek to bring harm to us. We hang an offering upon our ward tree this night, seeking favor with Odin, Olski himself, that he removes those ills which would bring famine to our homes. May the folk in the lands in which we live be purged of these evils. Odin, Allfather, Hanging Tear, we wish you luck on your hunt and give you gifts for your journey. May you hear our words and have favor over us. Alu. So that's an example of a prayer that my family and I have done. And each night of these 9 nights, we'll have a similar prayer and offering to Odin for each of the needs that we have. After this period happens, then we wait for the new moon to come, and then the first full moon after that new moon is when we actually have the Yule Visla, or the Yule festival. That is when that happens. And that is historically a 3-day festival, and on each of the days a bloat is performed. Now, I know because of modern times and how dispersed people are, and we don't live in lands all huddled together in manors and such. So getting together, especially when it's cold outside, is not as easy as any of us would like it to be. So, and one thing that my kindred does is we'll actually combine the 3 bloats into a 1-day Visla. I don't think that doing that causes any harm. I think the point of the 3-day Vislas was to bring us all together, and people would come from far away, and it wasn't as easy as just turning around, the next day and heading home. But that's an important time, because those 3 bloats that we do, the Thor bloat and the Yule bloat and the sonar bloat, is what begins this process that happens for that next year. And is also to give gifts and to remove the transgressions that we've done by fulfilling those bloats. And those transgressions that I speak of are harms that we cause to ourselves, to our families, to those that we love, our friends, our communities. It's also a time to make up, for oaths that were broken as well. That's what the purpose of the solar bloat was for. Traditionally, during the Yuletide period, which extended for more than 12 days, because it extended all the way till the Yule festival, there would actually, for the solar bloat, there would be a Yule boar. And the people would come and touch the boar and make oaths upon it. And this is a tradition that's important to keep and to practice, because it keeps us accountable. It keeps us accountable to our gods. It keeps us accountable to our family. It keeps us accountable to our communities, and keeps us accountable to ourselves and our actions. Would you have anything to add to that, Anthony?
Just 2 things, not directly about bringing the boar around, but just on touching on how you brought up that there are those that would say our ancestors didn't have the concept of evil. I would argue, or I don't want to say argue, I would acknowledge that from my readings and understandings, our ancestors did not have the Christianized concept of absolute good and absolute evil. But the ill, we fully understood that there were forces and beings out there that only brought harm. So in the purposes of the wild hunt, if there's no way you can look at it as evil, because you're working from evil as being only a Christian concept. We all can agree that there are forces out there that seek to cause you, your family, your folk, and the gods ill, cause them harm. So that would be the purposes of the wild hunt. And then also for our more hardcore Reconstructionist listeners that, the example you gave, they're going to ask, oh, what are your sources? Or, oh, that's just a modern interpretation. I would submit to them that we live in modern times. Viking era ancestors, just to use a broad term that everybody's going to understand, did not do things exactly the same way as our Stone Age ancestors. There were modern interpretations. And our purpose in giving the example that you gave is to give those people that don't know, or even those that they just don't have the time to do the studying that you and I and other people do, to just give them a starting point. If we can find a fully reconstructed 12-day ritual, we will absolutely share that. But for where we're at now, I think giving people somewhere to start practicing a tradition is just as important as finding and reconstructing things from our past. But even in reconstructing things from our past, we live in 2022. We live in modern times. We have to adapt those traditions to where we are at today, because that is the same things our ancestors did.
I'm going to stop you for real quick because I want to touch on something before you go further along. But I would use the example of a good modern reinventing the wheel, if you would say, for these 3-day Vislas, that putting them together because of modern constraints that we have with the distance that people live today, and not really having most people having the ability to host, like a whole family or kindred into their homes for a 3-day period, that doing that on, a single day, combining those rituals into a single day would be an okay reinvention or modern interpretation of how to perform these acts. When it comes specifically about the solstice and the Yule, I would argue that it actually is not a modern interpretation of what I'm explaining, but an ancient understanding that our folk had. We know, that every single Indo-European folk that ever existed had some sort of rituals that preceded the solstice, and during the solstice, and right after the solstice. And we know from our Eddic lore that we have that Mother Nat brings birth to Dagur, the day, and that the solstice is widely considered to be a remnant memory of like a Fimbulwinter, or when the sun did not shine. And as you mentioned earlier, there's some places in the northern hemisphere our ancestors lived where there were days that went without any sun at all. So, and then I would point as well to the attested historical texts about the Mother Night tradition that Bede records and talks about, and that we understand from the Eddic texts that Nat, the goddess Nat, brings forth. She is the mother of the night, and that what more suitable on the eve of the solstice day itself that we celebrate that Mother Night. Then we also know historically that during the same time frame, though people debate when and where, that there is a wild hunt that happens. And my argument is that the wild hunt precedes the birth of Dagur, comes after the birth of Dagur, after Mother's Night, after the solstice has happened. For it's then when Odin goes and cleans and clears, and there's a migration of souls that also transpire during this time. We know with historical accuracy that our ancestors gathered in groves during these periods. And we know with historical accuracy 100% that they hung offerings in trees. Now, it may be a modern interpretation to say that our current quote-unquote Christmas trees come from this tradition. I would concede that part. That might be a modern interpretation, but it is not a leap of logic of what has happened in the past and why we do this, why we hang a tree. I mean, the tree was one of the most holiest things to our folk, and that we hang things upon this tree, today ornaments, but in the past we know that we hung offerings to Odin. So this is a tradition that is attested, but the implementation of how it was done is not necessarily known. So when we reconstruct what this Yule tradition, this Yuletide tradition is, we know with certainty of fact that these certain things did in fact transpire. All I'm doing now is offering a suggestion that's cohesive, that fills in all of the gaps, of why we perform bloats and how all of the bloats in the course of the entire year relate to this specific time and period whenever Odin and his companions go on the wild hunt to purge the land of ills. So I do believe this is a authentic, valid tradition, and I'm just kind of filling in gaps on each day on how to actually acknowledge and build a tradition for my family that will carry on without confusion. Without confusion. That's what I'm doing. Don't hate me for doing that.
Well, and that's why I made a point to I respect the hardcore reconstructionists, but when that is the only way or the only mentality, we both know there are some people that they either stay completely in the past, or there are some people that adopt this forward-facing asatru, where they do not acknowledge the past at all. They seek to build new traditions. And I feel like those mentalities are extremes one way or another. And the only way that we are going to thrive is if the vast majority of us approach it in the middle. We look back to find the spirit and the essence and the why, but we also do things in such a way that we are going to be able to do them today. And maybe,
Exactly.
we can't just go blood-eagling traitors and oath-breakers, so we've got to adapt.
No, exactly. And, it's one thing to invent a brand new tradition. It's another thing to express a known tradition. Those are two different things. So we can have a modern interpretation of a tradition, like I mentioned earlier, for example, the Christmas tree, and what that represents and how it plays its role in this period of time. And we talked about this before, about the rocks, and you can either start from scratch and build energy around that, and there's validity to that too, or you can grab onto a tradition that already has power to it, that already has a connection for us, and attach yourself to that. And even for those that are skeptical, what are you doing for your children? How are you teaching them about our faith? How are you teaching them to be the person that they are metaphysically and spiritually? Even if you have a hard time grasping some of these concepts or reasons of why, you have to be able to do something and say something on a consistent basis for it to actually be a tradition. If something is new and made up, it's not actually a tradition. The tradition is the continual repetitiveness of what you're doing. And all we're saying is attach yourself to something that has significance. And by you going through these motions, your children will learn the significance because they won't know any other thing. The wild hunt. In Germanic lands all over northern Europe, the wild hunt was known far and wide. In Scandinavia, it was called Uskarie, the terrifying ride, or Odensjakt, Odin's hunt. In Middle High German, it was called Wotan's Heer, Odin's army. And in modern German, Wotende Heer, furious inspired army, or wild Jagd, the wild hunt. During this time, folk would make offerings to the Yule company, which wander about in the air. We call this Yule company as it derives its name from the word Yule, or Yule, which now signifies as much as the feast of the nativity of Christ for Christians in today's time. But in ages before, when we knew not Christianity, it was used for this time of the year during the winter solstice. Many folk confuse this period as being Yule itself. This confusion was sown hundreds of years ago when emperors and kings moved new Christian practices to coincide and overlay with our traditional holy days. They co-opted and gradually assimilated our traditions, slowly leading our folk away from our native beliefs and understandings. They did this by reinventing our customs with Christian ones. They overlaid our traditions with foreign ideas and concepts. Now, while this period that we are in is not Yule itself, it is connected to Yule. The Yule festival comes when the first full moon rises after the new moon that appears shortly after solstice. The old Anglian cognative Yule is Yoli. It was the Anglo-Saxons' name for a 2-month midwinter season. It incorporates both periods of time in December and in January in today's modern calendar. This calendrical reference attests how these two periods or 2 months blend together with one mythological structure that explains the theological functions of what we have come to know today as the 12 days of Yule. For the period we commonly call Yule consisted originally of the 3 days or nights of solstice, followed by the wild hunt for 9 days. The wild hunt was the culmination of the 9 sacred bloats in the course of the year, when Odin and his company would rid the land of beings which sought to harm our folk and bring the bjarga, or the help, for the 9 sacred needs. The Yule bloat performed during the Yule Visla happens after the wild hunt, when the full moon appears. That is the true Yule. The true 3-day Visla, when we perform Thor bloat, Yule bloat, and Sonar bloat. Hail Yolnir! Hail Yala Hera! Hail the master of Yule! Hail Odin!
This has been The Sacred Stew. I am Anthony. My co-host is James. Y'all have a good night.